to the place inside your mind where thoughts divide and mysteries unwind. Join us every Monday evening right here on Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com from 8 to 10 p.m. Eastern Time. And you will catch the Fenton Perspective with our great host, Lorian Fenton. Come listen in as she shares her amazing stories from the past to present, along with all of her guest secrets to the future. That's the Fenton Perspective every Monday evening right here from 8 to 10 p.m. Eastern Time, only on Revolution Radio. Oh, and you don't need to expect us. We're already here.
Extendivite really works. Just listen to what some people have to say.
Several years ago, I was developing a very severe situation. I called it my flippy heart. It was doing not good things, and I did not want to go to a medical doctor because I just knew they would give me a cover-up pill. I didn't want to get onto that sort of thing at all. When I learned it was garlic and cayenne, and cayenne is a healer. It is a wonderful herb. I said, I think I'm onto something here. I'll tell you, I wouldn't be without it. It did wonderful things for me.
Extendivite is only $69.95 for a 2-month supply of either capsules or liquid. Call now. That's 1-877-928-8822 or visit heartdrop.com.
Extend your life with Extendivite.
The opinions expressed on this radio station, its programs, and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and freedomslips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Aloha and welcome to Stargate to the Cosmos. And I'm your host, Janet Care Lessin, with my co-host, Dr. Sasha, Alex Lessin. And our producer is Thomas Becker, also known as a Mad Painter, and we're on Revolution Radio. And our guest today is Peter Moon, the author, researcher. And he was born and raised in California. He's primarily known for his his investigation of space-time projects, and particularly the Montauk Project, a series of mind-controlled experiments that were conducted at Montauk Point, New York, during the 70s and early 80s, and were reported to have resulted in full-scale experiences of time travel. His work caught the attention of time control scientist Dr. David Anderson, who at that time had the Time Travel Research Center on Long Island. Dr. Anderson eventually brought Peter to Romania in 2008, where he has investigated and paved the way for him to investigate other space-time projects, as discussed in the books known as the Transylvania series, one of which includes that what has been called the most amazing archaeological artifact in the history of mankind, a chamber that contains a holographic record of the Earth's history, as well as holographic readouts of human DNA and other species. And Peter's own journeys into Romania have become legendary. And Peter has a series of books, like Inside the Earth. This is a new book. We're going to cover that on June 30th. We're going to have Peter back. It's a new book. He has the Black Sun, the Montauk Book of the Dead, a whole Montauk series. I have all of his books, or most of them. I think I might be missing. I don't see all he's had here. And maybe Peter can give me a list of all the books he's written so I get them up on AquarianRadio.com. But today we are going to focus on this new, most intriguing series called Strange Angel. And it's about the Jack Parsons, a brilliant real-life rocket engineer who was hired by the U.S. government in the 1940s, to help with the rocket program. And apparently he was a very critical character in history, at least according to Strange Angel, a CBS series, and he dealt with the occult and Aleister Crowley, so it's a fascinating series. But I was talking to Peter earlier, and he said, well, he's got a series of reviews on each episode, and he says a lot of that is just Hollywood. So we're going to straighten that out, and we're also going to talk about, we lost two wonderful Montauk people this past year. Preston Nichols passed away, and Duncan Cameron, and we're going to tell you who they are and why they're important. So before we bring on Peter, I want to say hi to Sasha, my co-host, my beloved. Are you there, sweetheart?
Yeah, I'm interested in how the public has picked up this thing, and this funny movie that I've been watching, series. The name of the angel of Satan is Crowley.
Oh yeah, that's another series on, I think it's British, and that's on Amazon Prime. But we're going to focus on Strange Angel today. And Peter Moon, welcome to the show. How are you today?
I'm good, and thank you. It's nice to be back with both of you again.
We love having you on. So maybe you can give us a little history, and I forget which book you wrote about Jack Parsons. I remember reading it, and maybe more than one book. Do you remember?
I will give you some context, but first I want to mention that what Sasha just said, he made a very important contribution with his comment about this series on Crowley. Maybe we'll get to that at the end of it, because this is like to engage this energy in a series, and this is exactly what we're dealing with. This Strange Angel, Strange Angel, Strange Angel is a complete fabrication and an abomination when it comes to the history of what happened. It's historically an abomination. However, what they're doing, and this is done under the pretense of the producers saying, well, we wanted to give the writers creative freedom. What they do, however, in spite of that, they engage the persona of Jack Parsons, and they're trying to idealize it and get that persona across in terms of his contribution of taking us into the space age. And that, the engagement of that is stirring up the sympathetic energy of who the man actually was. So even though they've bastardized the history horribly, they're engaging the persona and embracing the myth, and to that degree, the real man, the real spirit. So they're trying, so far, they're trying to do him justice in a way that embellishes him and glorifies him and shows the very remarkable character that he is. And it's also very non-judgmental about magic as a subject. Mm-hmm. And this I found, it's the first time I've ever seen in a mainstream production where there's a certain objectivity. There's some corniness thrown in, with a lot of orgiastic sex and stuff that certainly didn't occur in the way that they show it. And with all of I haven't noticed any. I've noticed some slightly fat bottoms on the men, but the women are pretty much sculpted, beautiful women instead of, what do you, that's a glorification of that. So, but in any case, but when we go to the subject of Crowley, Aleister Crowley, and trying to do a TV or a movie that captures him. There was a movie done on him that I was told was just no good, because it's like doing sort of a cartoon sketch of Hitler. You're not going to get the full drift of Hitler let alone the escape, let alone the occult factors behind Hitler. So if you just do this is with Crowley, it'll tend to be dismissed. If you really engage the energies, you're engaging the energies of the Antichrist and therefore bringing on the so-called apocalypse, at least mentally, when you engage that. So it's a very heavy process. And this is why this movie series or docudrama, whatever they call it, fantasy drama, is capturing a significant amount of attention. So
right, I didn't know how it was doing in the ratings. So you're paying over here,
Sasha.
People are obsessing in Armageddon. It hits the sale button. Ding ding.
No. This is not being presented as Armageddon at all. That was my comment.
No, you're mixing the two series up, honey. You're missing the two series up. You didn't see Strange Angel.
Crowley and the other thing too is being shown as somebody that's bringing Armageddon forth.
Well,
okay, this is called Good Omen, but we're not talking about that series, honey. We're talking about Strange Angel. But Good Omen is like a tongue-in-cheek British farce. Almost reminds me of the Beatles or Monty Python, and so let's not confuse the two shows, okay, honey?
You don't
focused on Strange Angel.
You don't like me mentioning.
No,
I understand. You don't like.
No, because
delete my.
We're going to focus on. Okay, delete his comments. Stay focused on Strange Angel. Okay, so go back to you, Peter. Sorry about that.
Okay, where would you like me to go from here?
I don't remember. Where were we?
I didn't say where. I'd say where would you like me to go from here? I just gave some introductory comments.
Okay, so
discussing who Jack Parsons is.
Yes, let's go through Jack Parsons. Who is he? Why is he important in history? Which books did you write about? And what is the difference between the fact and the fiction? And that'll take 20 minutes.
Jack Parsons was a very unique man who grew up. He was born in the Parsons family that migrated to New England. And they were a very rich and influential clan or family in New England and also in the eastern Long Island, in both of those areas. And his family came to Pasadena when he was very young, and they settled there. His father had considerable wealth. And of course, Jack, I'm not going to go into his early history, but he had some very unique, I guess what you'd say, experiences, and that, his father was the president of the Hellfire Club, which was basically, I don't know if it's accurate to call it a satanic society, but it was a society that dealt with very dark occultism. There was nothing innocent, sweet about it. And he had his own, communion with the devil when he was young. And I believe that what happened was he had invoked the devil, and then he was being bullied, and this kid a couple years older, Ed Foreman, came up and kind of rescued him from the bullies. Because Jack was always dressed very prim and proper. He was tutored. He was very educated. So he was a little on the tending towards, I wouldn't call him a sissy, but he was sort of brought up to be a sissy, if you see what I'm saying, but with all the education and stuff. Yeah. So he had to contend with that element. And Ed Foreman protected him, and Ed became his friend for life. And Ed was a mechanic. He had a natural aptitude for mechanics. So as the rocket program developed, Ed became the guy who put the engines together. And Jack was the chemist, because he had a natural interest in and there's a intuitive capacity for chemistry. He was self-taught. He viewed himself as an alchemist, and he was far more brilliant in terms of pragmatic use of chemistry. Later on, there would be the Frank Molina would join the team as the theoretician. And of course, these characters are jumbled and misrepresented in the movie. None of these characters, their real names are used. But back to Jack Parsons. Jack Parsons was important because he basically discovered the solid fuel rocket. Rockets in Germany were successful with liquid fuel. The Americans weren't so successful with liquid fuels. That's initially what they were doing. But then one day, Jack had an idea. He saw some roofers. This was told to me personally by the archivist at Jet Propulsion Laboratory, that he was watching the roofers in the tar, and he watched how tar burned slowly. And he says, if we can get a long, slow burn, we can keep that rocket accelerating, and it can escape the velocity the velocity can overcome gravity. So that was the birthing seed idea of what made the solid fuel rocket work. And that was Jack's bright light bulb idea that went off. And he is credited by Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and they named a crater on the dark side of the moon after him. So and they recognize his genius in regards to that. So he was the one that made it happen, made the American space program happen. Now, where I encountered Jack Parsons, I will first tell the history of how I encountered Jack Parsons.
Okay.
I was working in what was called the personal office of L. Ron Hubbard in the 1970s, and it was my job to read letters and to give it. I went through different jobs in that office, but at this point I was reading letters that were sent in from the public, and I was giving responses that would be L. Ron Hubbard, a response on behalf of L. Ron Hubbard. I'd voice it into a tape recorder, and I would give this whole tape to a typist who would then type it up, and then it would be side-checked by a quality control person, probably signed by that person. I can't say that it was signed by that person because I never saw the person sign it, but you kind of knew it. And it would go out to the public. So you get all sorts of, most of the letters you would receive were, happy, they call it good roads and fair weather letters that were telling how wonderful their experiences were. A small percentage of these were concerned problems or situations in the organizations where they weren't behaving properly. So you sent out management alerts to deal with these, and there was a very smaller percentage yet of what you would call very negative stuff that went to the legal department or was just killed. The letters were killed and not answered. But somebody had once sent in this article showing how Jack Parsons and L. Ron Hubbard were engaged together in this magical working. It was probably from a magazine or a newspaper article. That was the first I heard of it. And that Hubbard was involved in all this very unusual stuff. And, of course, his standard pat answer for that was, people would ask him, what do you say? Well, I was sent in there to break up a ring of black magic magicians, and occultists. And that was what we were supposed to tell the public, that he was breaking up this ring of black magic. That's how I first encountered the name. And of course, when I later left Scientology and I read a book called L. Ron Hubbard, Madman or Messiah, it goes more deeply into his connection with Jack Parsons. And at that point, I realized that L. Ron Hubbard knew an awful lot more than certainly than I knew, and I wanted to know what he knew on this subject. This was outside the bounds of anything that we studied in Scientology. It was the work of Aleister Crowley. So I began studying that because here I'd spent so many years in that movement, and although I was free from it, I wanted to know what he knew. And I learned a hell of a lot in studying all these books. And all of these books set me with it was a preamble to me discovering Preston Nichols. Preston Nichols, of course, you had alluded to, passed away on October 5th of the past year, and he was 73 years old. And he was, of course, my co-author of the Montauk Project's Experiments in Time. Those experiences in the book were his, and he was a remarkable scientist and engineer who had experiences in time. Now, but when I first met Preston, he told me that one of the first things out of his mouth was that he was connected to, in an earlier life, him and Duncan Cameron, who just passed away on May 9th of this year. He was the intuitive psychic in the Montauk experiments. He said that in an earlier life, they were the Wilson brothers. And the Wilson brothers were the first manufacturers of scientific instruments in Great Britain, and they owned a company with Aleister Crowley's father. And this was the first, that was just a weird thing that I heard from Preston. It was the first thing out of his mouth. Now, I was just learning about the Montauk Project at that time. But when he told me that, I had a copy of Aleister Crowley's autobiography, and I looked to see if there was any reference to the Wilson brothers. There was not. But there was an indication that one of his best friends was a guy named Duncan Cameron. And then I also noticed that his real name was Edward Alexander Crowley, not Aleister, and that Edward Alexander Crowley, the two names Edward and Alexander were the names of Duncan Cameron and Edward Cameron, who were the two sailors involved in the Philadelphia experiment. So I had the names Edward and Alexander, both in Crowley's name. This began a whole series of name associations, synchronicities with the names Cameron and Crowley, and eventually Wilson. So I write about these in the book called Montauk Revisited, which was an attempt to verify Preston's assertions about the Montauk Project. Montauk Revisited, Adventures in Synchronicity. So when I encountered the Montauk Project and began to try and verify Preston's story, I began to have experiences with coincidence, synchronicity at a very accelerated level. And it was as if the universe was talking to me. But I'd have to pursue these synchronicities. Now, all of these synchronicities led me to the discovery that I was reading. There was a book catalog from a store it was in Manhattan at the time, The Magical Child. And The Magical Child was where a lot of the occultists hung out. It was a lot of stuff went down in that strange store. Anyway, I had a catalog from that store, and it said it was a release of a book, the Jack Parsons, Freedom is a Two-Edged Sword, a collected essays of John Whiteside, Jack Parsons, edited by his wife Cameron. It was edited by his wife Cameron, and it didn't say Marjorie Cameron, it just said Cameron. And I said, I'm facing all these synchronicities with the name Cameron. Why is her name Cameron? Why does it say Cameron? Why doesn't it say first name in Cameron? I said, this is very puzzling. And it said, the co-editor was Hymenaeus Beta, who was the outer head of Aleister Crowley's successor order, Ordo Templi Orientis. So I said, wow. I eventually bought the book. I looked at it and I saw that Cameron must be pretty old. And I said, I would love to talk to her and find out how she got this name Cameron and what she's about. But I was driven by my investigation, not out of curiosity in her so much.
Right.
Not even realizing what a pivotal character she was. And I wrote a very long letter explaining who I was to Hymenaeus Beta, because he had his P.O. box in the book. He edited that book out at Montauk, by the way. And it said P.O. Box 7666. So I sent the letter. I put it in the mailbox, and I took off for L.A. because I was going to the book convention in Anaheim, California, and I was going to release, and I was able to announce the release of the Montauk Project to a room full of, I guess what they call the New Age Published Retailers Association, which I had just joined to promote the book. You go to a book fair, you don't get an opportunity like that anymore. You hardly ever did.
Right.
I was able to announce this book to a room full of people, give a 1-minute commercial, and boy, did it create a stir and some interest. And these people are buyers in the community, networkers, and it really helped the book take off, amongst other things. So anyway, I walk into that book fair, and I see this the first thing I see is this big stack of occult books on occult magic and Aleister Crowley books, and I see this man he's dressed like a biker. His name, he's a famous author actually in the occult world, Christopher Hyatt, Dr. Christopher Hyatt. I think his actual name was Alan Miller, but he had quite a reputation. And I remember seeing him, I said, this man is completely unapproachable by most people. And I just went over there and I said, look, I'm looking for Marjorie Cameron. And you probably heard of her. And he says, yeah. He says, go see so-and-so over at Mystic Fire Video. So I went right to Mystic Fire Video, and I hung out at Mystic Fire Video for quite a few days. And that was where the occultists would all kind of hang out in group, because they were all affiliated. Mystic Fire Video was basically the company that was most famous for doing the Joseph Campbell videos, which were filmed out at Montauk.
Okay.
But the owners, Sheldon Rockland, I think his name was, and his wife, very nice people, but they weren't so much occultists, but they had hired, this Hymenaeus Beta to be their editor. Now, I didn't know this guy was Hymenaeus Beta. I began telling him who I was, gave him the book. After several discussions, he was courteous enough to read the book that night. And he also, I figured out that he was Hymenaeus Beta. And he says, yeah, please don't tell anybody. You can go online and now find out what the name is now. But that was all very secret at that time. And he was courteous enough to call Cameron and tell her who I was and that I was interested. And he opened the gateway for me to meet her. She was willing to meet with me, and he gave me her phone number, and it ended in 6606. So I had these numbers. This is the number of the beast, according to,
right.
It was Aleister Crowley's number. So then I drove from Anaheim. I took a day off from the book fair. Those book fairs used to last 4 or 5 days in those days. And I took, I think, the Sunday afternoon off, and I drove to West Hollywood, and I talked with her for 4 hours on her, I think we were in her backyard. And we had a very nice conversation. She knew nothing about the Montauk Project she'd heard of the Philadelphia experiment. But when I told her all of this story, and she told me all sorts of stuff she would never tell the reporters because they were always trying to get an exclusive from her. And she knew I respected her. And that I could, I wasn't like a typical, journalist who was trying to sensationalize. She said she got the number 6606 when the LA Times had run an article on her and calling her the whore of Babylon, and they put her phone number in the paper. And so she had to change it, and it ended up with 6606. That's how she got the number. So anyway, she at the end of my story, and I told her all this, I said, I listened to her story, then she listened to my story, and I said, I'm very fortunate to be able to meet you, because I would have, flown out here at my own expense just to meet you. I'm already out here, so it's very convenient for me. And I said, but can you tell me, I don't understand why all of these synchronicities and the name Cameron and stuff, why is all this happening? She says, well, the only thing I can say, she says, is that my real name is not Cameron. It's Wilson. And I was adopted by my uncle, who was a Cameron. But I was really a Wilson, and so was L. Ron Hubbard. He was a Wilson. I said, how do you know that? She says, I read it in a book. And sure enough, it is in a book, Barefaced Messiah. L. Ron Hubbard's father, Harry Ross Hubbard, who I did get to see when I was in Scientology, he was born as a Wilson and adopted by the Hubbard families in Iowa. And this is also where Marjorie Cameron was from Iowa. So this was like a big revelation that all of these synchronicities of the names Cameron and Wilson that I was pursuing led to her front door, literally. And I was, sort of brought there by destiny. And I established a friendship and an association with her that lasted until she passed away. I was able to visit her in person one more time, which was a very interesting adventure on that. But so anyway, it gave me a lot of, I guess what you'd say, personal insight or rapport into what the Babylon working was that wouldn't necessarily have been afforded to me if I was just reading books about it. So that's how I kind of got involved in the Jack Parsons phenomena, by following the trail of synchronicity.
The trail.
Exactly.
I have a question before we go down. I saw some connection to Robert Heinlein somewhere when I was skimming earlier. What was Heinlein's connection to Parsons or Hubbard?
Okay.
Was there a connection with Robert Heinlein?
Oh, yeah. Heinlein was a very, I guess what you call esteemed science fiction writer. They called him the dean of science fiction. And he was in the Navy. He had to go out of the Navy because he had a medical condition. I don't remember what it was. It might have been his eyes, but I don't remember. So he had to bow out of the Navy. And when wartime came, he was working science fiction at that time, and he had a common editor with L. Ron Hubbard, Joseph Campbell. I think Joseph Campbell introduced the two. And they were both Navy personnel eventually, if not at that time. And when the war came, Heinlein wanted to contribute, but he wasn't qualified for regular service. So they put him on special projects because he was a scientist in his own right, and he worked at the Philadelphia Naval Yard. And in a highly classified project, which is still classified to this day, and he worked with others. He recruited other science fiction writers, some of which are very noted. L. Sprague de Camp, Isaac Asimov, and were two of them that he recruited, and they worked on special projects with him. L. Ron Hubbard was summoned and brought to the Philadelphia Naval Yard and also slept at Heinlein's house. They had, I guess, what they call, it was sort of a flop house there while they were, and they would have these think tank sessions because the Navy and or the Defense Department, which was the Department of War at that time, they used science fiction writers as a think tank, and they used it as for the battle plan and battle strategy and stuff like that. So science fiction writers were taken very seriously by the military, if not, even though they were kind of held up to ridicule in the public at that time. And they wrote the pulps. They wrote on pulp paper published on pulp paper because it was cheap. And I think there was also a scarcity of paper during the war, and maybe even during the Depression. So anyway, there was a relationship between the editors of science fiction and the War Department. There's a very strong connection there. So this is how Heinlein. What, Janet?
I was going to take it one more step. When I got involved with the Star Trek conferences after they were trying to cancel it in 1969, they did cancel it, so we were doing the conferences in the early 70s. Robert Heinlein, Isaac Asimov, J. Allen Hynek, and G. Roddenberry would do these panels. So, and the story is that Roddenberry was actually getting real information and, putting it into Star Trek about the secret space program or what's really going on. So this is fascinating. The synchronicities, connecting the dots.
Okay. But in any case, Heinlein was working at the Philadelphia Naval Yard. Now, he moved out. I think he even owned a home in Hollywood prior to that. He was East Coast and West Coast, but he had a home in Lookout Mountain, which is now owned. Well, he didn't own the home. He lived down the street from what was called First Motion Picture Unit. First Motion Picture Unit was when the U.S. military co-opted Hollywood, and they created this big base there. There was all sorts of secret stuff that went on there, but one of the things they did was filming. And part of First Motion Picture Unit were Ronald Reagan, who did a lot of the films for the military. There was this home that is now that was the First Motion Picture Unit is now owned by Jared Leto, and it's no longer, but it still generates a lot of strange rumors. Heinlein lived down the street from there on Lookout Mountain Avenue. It's called Wonderland is the name of that area. I think there's also a Wonderland Street out there. Now, Heinlein lived in a house, and and one of his roommates that he took on was L. Ron Hubbard. This is after the war.
Oh, wow.
Or perhaps in 1945. In fact, it was 45. The war wasn't quite over yet, or it was just about the ceasefire was ended in 45. So Hubbard would have been, he was on leave, and I think he visited, but his address, there's actually letters written by L. Ron Hubbard where he uses Heinlein's address on Lookout Mountain. So they were roommates. And when I found these, I had heard these stories years ago when I first got into Scientology. I remember, being in the lobby of the center, on Olive Drive in Davis. And I mentioned to, one of the ladies there, I said, this place reminds me of Stranger in a Strange Land. That was the book that Heinlein wrote. Mm-hmm. It is said to have contributed heavily to the hippie movement. And she goes, well, she says it's, she says Hubbard and Heinlein used to be roommates. I never found any substantiation of that until I saw these letters on the internet a few years ago. They were indeed shared the same address. I knew he had slept at Heinlein's house in Philadelphia, but I didn't know that they'd actually, it was from that home that he was quote unquote sent into the parsonage, which was what they called Jack Parsons' house, on South Orange Grove, Boulevard in Pasadena, on Millionaires Row, they called it. And he sent, Hubbard said that he was sent in there. Now, Heinlein and Hubbard both had very deeply classified jobs. And you have to consider who Hubbard was. How on earth would he be cavorting with the top rocket scientists on the planet, or at least in America? Why was he allowed to go in there and hobnob with them? He always said, for PR purposes, that he was sent in there to break them up. Well, he certainly broke up Jack Parsons. That's a fact. I also believe that he was highly interested in it. Douglas Dietrich, who provided Gene Roddenberry with a lot of his information when he was working as a librarian at the Presidio, he said that Hubbard was working for Crowley, that he was an agent of Crowley, and working for British intelligence in the capacity of British intelligence, if it could even be called British intelligence. Hubbard did have connections to British intelligence when he was in China, with a guy named Ian McBean. This goes back, there's some very unusual letters written from, or at least one unusual letter written from Ian McBean where he sort of welcomes Hubbard into the fold. Hubbard's just like a teenager at that point. It's a very unusual letter. Ian McBean was like working out of Beijing as an ambassador or in some sort of, in the embassy, not an ambassador, but he was he was very highly placed in British intelligence. So Hubbard, there's a capacity to say that Hubbard was. But in any case, to get back to your question about Heinlein, Hubbard went in and was introduced to Jack Parsons, to the best of my knowledge, and these things can be disputed, at the LA Science Fiction or Science Fantasy Club, which Jack Parsons used to attend regularly. Heinlein and Hubbard were noted science fiction writers. So that's how they met. Hubbard went into the parsonage. I guess he met him, I think it was in the summer. He went back there, moved in with his trailer, moved away from his family, and moved in with Parsons. And there he set up and became the local notoriety. He was always, and he fit right in with the magic. This is what surprised Parsons. L. Ron Hubbard was like living, breathing, magical initiate. And he wrote to Crowley and said, I've never seen anybody who's so Thelemic, which means Thelema is the tradition of Aleister Crowley, do without wilt. He was living his will. Mm-hmm. And I would testify that Hubbard did live his will. So how does Hubbard show up and he's like more Crowley-esque than Parsons himself. And this speaks of the prospect that Hubbard indeed was an initiate into Thelema. He certainly had read Crowley's books by that time, according to the testimony of his son. He was familiar with Crowley's work. So he also had attained communion with his holy guardian angel, who he referred to as the Empress. So Hubbard was in touch with his basic magical self. So this is how, where Heinlein used to hang out at the parsonage, according to Cameron. And she said that he got all of his information from Jack and he put it into Stranger in a Strange Land, and it was all borrowed from Jack. He knew nothing about magic himself, although Heinlein was very, I guess what you call avant-garde, sexually liberated for that time period. He had, was into wife swapping and this sort of thing. That's a fact. That's in his archives. And I think he had pawned off one of his wives on Hubbard or something like this. One thing I've basically come up, and it's in this new, the latest episode where they have the Magus stealing Jack's wife. He's about to steal his wife. Wife stealing seems to be par for the course with magicians. We're not talking about stealing girls. Okay. We're talking about stealing wives. It just seems to be a habit of the what do you call it? In industrial. What do they call it? Nature of the beast.
Nature of the beast.
Pun not intended, but applicable. Nature of the beast. So, and yes, you can certainly expect to have your life turned upside down if you join a magical order or even participate in magical ritual. So, in any case, that tells you how Heinlein, and she did not like Heinlein, she said. She considered him a cad, and she was never impressed with him. She said he was too Hollywood.
Oh, okay.
That answers your question.
I was too young when I met Heinlein and Asimov Macon, and I was about 18 or 19. I didn't know anything about them other than they were these writers up on the, talking about the future. We were all excited about Star Trek, and the potential. So this is interesting how it's all tied in together. So, and so the Magus is about to steal the wife. Yeah, that's where we left off with an orgy, and everybody was. It reminded me of the 60s, but this was the 40s. So
this was the 40s, and of course, those orgies did not occur like they showed them. They had a lot of liberation and a lot of freedom. As Cameron said to me, she says, we had a lot of freedom. And she says, in those times, things were so straight-laced. She says, but Jack and I, she says, we're not swingers. We were not swingers, but we had a lot of freedom. And what Jack said, or what the archivist at Jet Propulsion Laboratory, John Bluth, and you can see he gives some very presentable discussions on Jack Parsons on YouTube, John Bluth, BLUTH. He told me that when Jack worked at Aerojet, of course, the company he was initially making, before he was they made rockets to the moon. They made rockets that were called jet-assisted takeoffs that were put under the wings of airplanes on aircraft carriers, because you could get a jet propulsion that would enable the plane to take off from a short runway on an aircraft carrier. So this company that created those rockets was called Aerojet General, and Jack was a equal stockholder and member of the board with Frank Molina, the technical expert or the mathematics expert, Ed Foreman, the mechanic, and Theodore von Karman. Theodore von Karman was basically the head of the guy at Caltech. He was a leading scientist and professor at Caltech who sponsored the rocket program, tolerated it, and formed Aerojet General, all in liaison with the U.S. Army. Theodore von Karman was from Hungary. He was, and he was Jewish, and he would kind of show up in all these countries just before the war would start, like World War I and World War II. He was involved, I think, in the aerodynamics of the first helicopter. He was a genius, and he has a very interesting history in and of himself. He was also he used to pal around with Jane Mansfield a lot, who was married to a Hungarian. And Jane Mansfield, who's most famous for being killed in a car accident, which pretty much tore her head off, and she was she had been warned not to do this by Anton LaVey. She was a high priestess of the Church of Satan, Anton LaVey's Church of Satan. She was also a physicist and a very smart woman.
She was a physicist?
She was a physicist, yes, a degreed physicist.
Oh,
Jane Mansfield, the blonde bombshell who was mostly known for her, her huge breasts and her sexuality, and she was a movie star. She was,
it sounds like she was murdered somehow. Preston got hit with
murdered?
this vibe. Yeah, it just the dramatic way that she died. It doesn't. Do you suspect something? Tell me.
I haven't studied her enough to know, but Anton LaVey had warned her, and she got her head, messed up with a truck or something. I don't think it was like a hit that was done on her, but it was like when you're dealing with occult forces, even if you're just sort of palling around with them, they can hit you. It's like, I had a problem myself. I was hit in the rear by a car when I was actually writing the book about the Book of the Law in one of my books, Pyramids of Montauk. I'm exposing secrets about it, and you're not supposed to write about it. So, like, say, I had just been dropped my daughter off and was coming home, and I'm sitting there at this light, and this car whaps me from the behind. So it gave me whiplash. And it was next to a diving shop, and the guys in the diving shop come running out and saying, we'll get an ambulance. You get an ambulance. I said, no, I don't want an ambulance. Just let me use your phone. So I go in and I call my wife and I say, I told her, and she says, wait, she says, she was like acting like I was an irritant. I'm trying to tell her I was in an accident. And she says, the mechanic's on the phone and he's got the car. And he said, the other car, and he says, you need your brakes fixed. You need your brakes fixed. I said, well, that's funny because I said, I just got rear-ended. And so I said, yeah, tell him to fix the brakes. Tell him to fix the brakes. So she was asking for my, I guess, permission or authority because it was my car. I was in her car. So anyway, I walked outside and I see this man waving his hand at me. And he goes, Mr. Moon. He says, do you remember me? I said, yeah. You were my old mechanic when I first moved to Long Island. He goes, old mechanic, thanks a lot. He says, that was my son that hit you. He says, he didn't have his brakes working. I told him to fix his brakes. He didn't have his brakes.
Whoa.
So here it is. I had a mechanic. I had the mechanic's son hit me. And at the same time, the brakes on my other car, which was my car, needed fixing. So, I mean, this was an occult coincidence, an occult factor, and it told me that the forces did not like me communicating this. But I did do it. I passed, and it all worked out. This happened to me years later. It was my second whiplash incident. I was going to Washington, D.C. to speak to a group of Moors in Washington, D.C. I get 5-10 minutes out on the highway, and all of a sudden, all the cars stop. I stop like, an inch to avoid the bumper of the car in front of me, and this car in the back whacks me. It just whacks me, and we pull over to the side. He's an illegal alien driving a car, and the policeman, and basically, so in other words, I was getting an occult whack when that happened. It messed up my bumper, but I just said, okay, told the cop, it's okay. I just drove down to Washington, D.C. and, made it there. But then, that afternoon it was that afternoon or the next afternoon, I don't remember when I was supposed to meet. No, it was that afternoon. I was supposed to meet this author and this brain scientist, Carl Pribram, very famous brain scientist, and his girlfriend, Catherine Neville, who is my friend. She's a very wonderful author who writes about very similar subjects to me. Beautiful novels she writes, Catherine Neville. So I was going to introduce her to the Moors. I was going to meet one of my Moorish friends. And we're going to meet at this, I think it's the St. Mary's Cathedral. It's a very famous cathedral. And so we're going there, and my Moorish friend, so we get there and all the lights are off on all the stoplights, and there's all these trees down, and it's like I'm having to negotiate all these trees and all this stuff, and I finally get there and we meet, and my Moorish friend Sid Catlett, who was a very famous basketball player in his day, says, "What the hell is with you?" He says, you're coming down here. It's summer. It's July. And we just had the biggest storm in the history of Washington, D.C. It was an ice storm. And the center of it was right where we were meeting. That was the center of it. And it busted all the lights. I mean, the electricity was down because the ice was so heavy on the wires, the electric wires, that it broke them. So this was occult phenomena that I've had to deal with. I could also tell you, the last time Preston Nichols, Duncan Cameron, and Al Bielek and I were all together was in Sparta, New Jersey, and that was what had happened then. What impeded the whole event, which was a weekend, biggest storm in the history of New Jersey at that time. They might have had some bigger ones since. Biggest storm in the history of New Jersey. So the weather does follow and pursue these various things. So when you're dealing with this stuff, it is quite real. It is quite visceral. And this is why I said, if you begin to engage a true docudrama or story and try to tell Aleister Crowley's life, you might as well be writing about the Antichrist himself. Because if you're not, you're just one step away. So you're engaging all of that energy if you're doing an honest job. If you're just going to portray him as the wickedest man in the world who did all sorts of weird things, then you're just making a horror movie. But if you actually engage the truth of who and what he is, and this is what this strange angel is doing, it's trying to give a representative idea of who Jack Parsons was. So that's my story.
Wow. Fascinating. We have 2 minutes before the break. Yeah, so that was an interesting comment you just said. If you try to say who he really is, you might not be able to even get it out there because all these weird things. I wonder if this staff of this series is having these strange phenomena happening to them. I guess we won't know unless somebody writes about it. But maybe that's why they've gone off script to protect themselves, just make it a fantasy. I don't know. This is very interesting. So we're going to be coming up on our break. So what would you like to say? We have 2 minutes, and then we've got another hour to go.
I suspect that part of their motivation, Hollywood is very funny this way. It's very funny. I think they're trying to avoid a conflict with the heirs of Cameron's estate. I think they're trying to run around that by avoiding.
And then they avoid a conflict, so we'll talk about that more, like what that means.
That's just
They mentioned Werner von Braun in this, and so did Parsons have interactions with Werner von Braun, and was that why he was brought over?
Yes, he had a correspondence. He had a correspondence with Werner von Braun. This show indicates that they talked on the phone. I think they did talk on the phone, if I recall historically. They had phone conversations paid for by Parsons' grandfather. Long distance calls in the 30s or 20s, which were a lot more expensive. But
they were expensive.
He did have a correspondence.
And it kind of indicates that maybe they shared secrets, and that's how von Braun maybe came by his formulas, or vice versa.
Well, the real genius behind von Braun was God, I can't remember his name. He was from Transylvania. I'll have to look him up during the break. I just can't remember his.
Okay, well.
And yeah, he was the father of rocketry. He was the mentor of Werner von Braun, and they have a whole history of rocketry in Transylvania that goes back 100 years.
Okay, we're at our commercial break. We'll find out who that fellow is, and we'll be back in 5 minutes. See you in 5.
Radio at freedomslips.com, and we'll be right back after this message.
Wadiya will remain a dictatorship. Oh, be quiet. Why are you guys so anti-dictators? Imagine if America was a dictatorship. You could let 1% of the people have all the nation's wealth. You could help your rich friends get richer by cutting their taxes and bailing them out when they gamble and lose. You could ignore the needs of the poor for healthcare and education. Your media would appear free, but would secretly be controlled by one person and his family. You could wiretap phones. You could torture foreign prisoners. You could have rigged elections. You could lie about why you go to war. You could fill your prisons with one particular racial group, and no one would complain. You could use the media to scare the people into supporting policies that are against their interests.
Tune in Monday through Friday, 4 p.m. Eastern Time, for Liberation Nation with Deacon John, where America comes to hear the truth.
I know this is hard for you Americans to imagine, but please try.
Ohio Exopolitics will be on from 4 to 6 p.m. Eastern on Studio A. Mark Schneider will have guests on that will discuss many important topics, including the state of the world today. However, much of the show will be dedicated to the writings of Edward Albert Meyer. Let me read a short passage from one of his writings. Love is the highest principle of creation, and through it, everything exists in absolute logic. All of nature in its indescribable splendor is nothing but the love of creation, which is expressed visibly. The love of creation is everywhere, because without it, nothing at all would be able to exist. Please join Mark on Ohio Exopolitics from 4 to 6 p.m. Eastern on Studio A.
It is no secret that the so-called mainstream media is best described as controlled propaganda. Countless news stories are either totally ignored or spun with half-truths, and because of this, essential facts and vital information are often compromised. Join Dr. Ott every Friday night on Studio B at 10 p.m. Eastern and learn why The Story Behind the Story was nominated for a Peabody Award in its second year of producing unparalleled broadcasting excellence in 1997. That is, if you really care about learning the truth.
Transcending time and space, let us take you to the place inside your mind where thoughts divide and mysteries unwind. Join us every Monday evening right here on Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com from 8 to 10 p.m. Eastern Time. And you will catch the Fenton Perspective with our great host, Lorian Fenton. Come listen in as she shares her amazing stories from the past to present, along with all of her guest secrets to the future. That's the Fenton Perspective every Monday evening right here from 8 to 10 p.m. Eastern Time, only on Revolution Radio. Oh, and you don't need to expect us. We're already here.
Extendivite really works. Just listen to what some people have to say.
Several years ago, I was developing a very severe situation. I called it my flippy heart. It was doing not good things, and I did not want to go to a medical doctor because I just knew they would give me a cover-up pill. I didn't want to get onto that sort of thing at all. When I learned it was garlic and cayenne, and cayenne is a healer. It is a wonderful herb. I said, I think I'm onto something here. I'll tell you, I wouldn't be without it. It did wonderful things for me.
Extendivite is only $69.95 for a 2-month supply of either capsules or liquid. Call now. That's 1-877-928-8822 or visit heartdrop.com.
Extend your life with Extendivite.
The opinions expressed on this radio station, its programs, and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and freedomslips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Stargate the Cosmos. And I'm Janet Care Lessin with my co-host, Dr. Sasha Alex Lessin, and our producer is Thomas Becker. And Peter Moon is our guest. We're going to get back to our show in just a minute here, but we want to remind everybody to please go over to that donation button on revolution.radio and make your contribution this week, because we really need your donations to keep shows like this on the air. And Matt Pater, Thomas, how are we doing with our fundraising?
Not real good. We still need $1,000 and only got 5 days to go.
Oh my goodness, we didn't move from 2 days ago. Come on, people, make your donation. Come on now. Alrighty, Sasha, are you there? Are you back?
Yes, I am. We're tracking Peter Moon. The so-called synchronicities. It becomes quite apparent that it's way beyond what a random probability could ever give, that there's some kind of intelligence that's directing the events in your life, Peter. So let them take you to the next step. What's next in your saga?
Well, I was mentioning that the mentor of Werner von Braun was Hermann Oberth, Oberth. He was lived in Sibiu, Sibiu, which is a very quaint, beautiful city in Transylvania. It's a city I almost always stop and have lunch or dinner in on my way up to the heart of Transylvania when I'm traveling in Romania. I've been there several times. There was, if you look at rocketry, you can look up online, pioneering spacecraft propulsion in late medieval Transylvania. There was a man named Conrad Haas, Haas, who was, he was doing rockets for the Imperial Army under Ferdinand I, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. And there is plans, they show rocket plans, and rocketry was very advanced. Now, I've been told by my mother-in-law, who studied under Hermann Oberth, I think in the 3rd grade, she was very specially trained. She was a general in the army in Romania, and she told me that they've taken most of that stuff out of the museum. Some of it's in the museum. Jules Verne also spent he married a woman from Transylvania, and his books, Journey to the Center of the Earth, I think it's called Man to the Moon or First Man in the Moon, and Castle in the Carpathians are all based upon his journeys into Transylvania. So there's quite a heritage there. But anyway, you're asking about Werner von Braun and the connection to Jack Parsons. They try and make something out of it in this drama. I don't know how much there was to it, because when Parsons was in his heyday in the early 40s, the two countries were at war. So Germany and von Braun, they're kind of like intimating that Parsons might have been responsible for encouraging them to bring the Nazi scientists over. And they're making it sound like he was influential in that regard. I don't know that that's true. It's certainly a very interesting thing to speculate about. But what this new series does, it shows the extreme level of high security that Parsons was privy to, and they were watching him like a hawk. They watched him like a hawk because he was on the cutting edge of aerodynamic technology. And he was probably their most valuable piece of, war secret that they had in that regard. So for Hubbard to be even allowed to and tolerated to associate with him speaks volumes of who Hubbard either was or might have been. The show does a very good, it's fiction, but they show this improbable character, Ernest, who makes no sense whatsoever. But he's a disciple of Crowley, and he's shooting up Jack with heroin.
Right.
And then he just has a vision where he basically encounters Crowley in a coffee shop, a diner, and they have a discussion, and you kind of see how Crowley is orchestrating things, working for Navy intelligence, and they're intimating that maybe they did meet. But if they didn't meet, certainly the occult association and lineage is there between the two. So is this the work of the beast? And all the time they have, in the series, they have the beast sort of knocking at Jack's door. And this is all a setup for something. It's a setup for an encounter with the beast. But we're wondering, Hubbard's going to come in when everything is all whipped up into a complete frenzy on the magical forefront. And that's when, so it's going to be very interesting because they say they're going to depict L. Ron Hubbard. The only, there might be one person who had a real name was, of course, Werner von Braun. They use his real name, but he's not really a character. They used Jack Williamson, a science fiction writer. They used his name. Out of that, I can't recall any other names that were real. Jack's first wife, Helen Parsons, is not called Helen. She's called Susan Parsons, and she's a complete fiction. And her father and her little sister, Patty, who would be Sarah Northrop Parsons Hubbard in real life, they have a priest father who's abusive. In real life, Sarah and Hector were sexually molested by their stepfather. Here, it's a priest, so they're trying to build this conflict between the priest and the lodge, the occult lodge, which it didn't happen that way. But so they're creating all this false drama, and certainly Crowley is sitting there, and they're giving, what they're doing with this is they're giving magic, the subject of Crowley's magic, I'll say this in quotes, fair shot. They're not prejudiced against it. They're, extolling the most possible virtuous aspect that you could project into it. In real life, it's not like they have the priestess doing the will of the magician, and she's there giving every ounce of love and care to carry out the will of the magician. You're not going to find, too many people in magical orders acting that way, in pragmatism. I don't need to lecture you, either one of you, on the weird stuff that can be conjured up when people start engaging in tantric sex. And then when you're doing it in the context of an order, a mystical order where there's a hierarchy, it can lead to all sorts of problems.
Yeah. Setting and intention. So yeah, they do, I guess they want you to relate to the characters, relate to Susan, relate to Jack. If they become too, unrealistic, you won't relate to them. So the writers want you to be sympathetic to Jack and identify with him, because he's the hero of this story. But, so you researched the actual historical Jack, and we've got the fictional Jack. He actually did die in a garage explosion. What do you know about? He
had his own.
What happened?
It was the coach house. He had lost his fortune with Hubbard. He was making fireworks, and he'd also worked for the Hughes Company. But he was planning on going down to Mexico. Him and his wife Cameron were going down to Mexico, and they were gonna. I think he was going to have, if I recall, produce fireworks down there. And she went to gas up the car. She heard this explosion. And it was big. And supposedly there was this vial of mercury fulminate, which is very explosive. They think that Jack dropped it. It might have, but there was an explosion from under the floorboards, so maybe there was a bomb exploded. I went into this ad nauseum at one time. I went into the Pasadena library and actually tried to study as much as I could. I wrote to the police, but they said they closed the file on it years ago. So they were of no help in that regard. But it's possible he was assassinated. It's possible. But see, the thing that's important, it was an occult death. And he had written a book called The Black Pilgrimage, in which he was basically giving his life to carry out his will. And the Babylon Working, which he is so famous for, as is Hubbard and Cameron, was designed to turn around the oppression of the patriarchal hierarchy that runs this planet. So that was what he was trying to do. And on a deeper level, the Babylon Working was designed to incarnate a moon child. And it was to incarnate Babylon, which is the mother goddess. And what showed up in the beginning of the Babylon Working was the manifestation of Cameron herself, who had an auto accident nearby, went to the door for help, and Jack says, "Oh, here's my calling." She had an unusual aptitude for the work they were doing, so she became part of the working. And I'm sure that they were trying to get her pregnant and incarnate Babylon. I think she had a miscarriage. There's even a story by Douglas Dietrich that the miscarried baby was allowed to survive. They took it from her, and he grew up into, somebody who ended up being under the tutelage or control of Michael Aquino. I can't vouch for that, but that's because Douglas talked to the guy. And that's a whole bizarre story. So he was being monitored. The problem with the Babylon working is in other words, when you create a magical act, it's the intention of the magician, which in this case is Jack. He says in his writings that he used L. Ron Hubbard as a familiar. He didn't have a cat to use in the operation or another animal. So he says, I'm going to use Ron as my familiar. Ron is going to help me carry this out. So, but the purpose of the whole working is to create the incarnate Babylon, which is a moonchild. The book he writes is called Liber 49. 49 refers to a gestation period of 49 days. This is not generally understood of giving a virgin birth. And what happens in a magical operation, you're imbibing sympathies. So you may not get what you want. You may get a sympathetic harmonic vibration of it or a watered down version of it. And so far, but because his intention was so strong, we can't say that his operation is done because his work is only becoming known on a broad basis now. Magicians have always recognized it. People in occult circles have always recognized it. But the thing is this is what Jack would say to Cameron. She taught me this. He says, you don't get to any idea of what a man contributed until 100 and more like 150 years after his death. He says, only after 50 years do you begin to get an inkling. So Parsons died in 52. Oh. And I wrote about him in 94. In 2002, that's 50 years. So then a bunch of other literature started coming out about him. Strange Angel, Sex and Rockets. So he started to get some more recognition. And so now it's like 60, we're not even quite at 70 years of his death. And now he gets a TV show. Wow. So we have not heard the last of Jack Parsons or his contribution, whatever it might be. So this is what we're dealing with. And in the case of L. Ron Hubbard, he died in 86. That would make him 20. He's only been dead 33 years. So we're not really getting any inkling of him for another 17 years if we go by this maxim, as Jack used to say. So,
wow, fascinating. Sasha had a question, but go ahead. So, what's your conclusion? Then Sasha's question. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Sasha.
Well, it wasn't a question as much as some of the other people that we've been interviewing said that we already had anti-grav craft for quite a while, and what's all this business with burning and creating explosions, whether it's from solid or liquid fuel, when these guys on top, and Parsons probably for sure knew what was really going on, if there is a really involving anti-grav craft. Now, I don't know. I ain't never seen none, but I wonder what your take is.
I will tell you a couple of things. I don't certainly claim to be an expert or even follow the subject of anti-gravity. What I would tell you, though, is that, Preston Nichols had a lot of side stories that he really didn't talk in public. And, but one time he used to have a facility on Long Island when he was younger, and he was experimenting with anti-gravity. This guy was a genius. And it was the guy who was famous for remote viewing, Ingo Swann, came down and shut it down, told him to shut it down. So in other words, he was stirring up stuff. Now, what that probably means is that he was probably stirring up competition to what they might have had in the secret sector. They didn't want competition. He knew all about how those jetpacks used to work too. You know, they used to, like, say, if you look at, I think it was the 1967 All-Star game in Anaheim, they'd have, in some of the games they'd have, the big games, I remember them at baseball All-Star games, they'd show a guy flying across the stadium in a jetpack.
Oh yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, and he told me the whole problem with that. They used an awful lot of fuel. They weren't real pragmatic, but they worked. So, I would also tell you that I found out from somebody who had a real inside connection to Dr. David Anderson that there was they could suspend a drop of water in the laboratory there. They could suspend a drop of water in space. So they kind of knew stuff about anti-gravity there. How that information gets distributed into industry and the military-industrial complex is a whole different and separate issue in and of itself. So, you know, that's what we're dealing with when we're talking about anti-gravity. I'm sure they have it, but it's like, who else can use it? I often suspect that Dr. David Anderson, you know, he has a temporal time detector where if somebody's doing time experiments, he can find out and go knock on their door and tell them what they're doing. And I imagine, or I wonder if the same thing happened to him when he discovered how to travel in time, if somebody came up and did the same thing to him. I often wonder that. So
we've heard one of the people that we've been interviewing says the very same thing, that there's like a time travel division that tries to make sure that people don't do any authorized changes that change stuff. This whole structure of the people that deal with time and can travel in time, and people that regulate them to some degree. Have you ever heard any of that stuff?
Well, I mean, it's a great plot for science fiction, but I mean, you know, people talk a lot about, and they'll talk a little bit about this, that, and the other thing, but I'm just saying is, you know, it's like everything like in an initiatory path, you know, and you could look at this from the prospect of you know, sort of more of a Hindu tradition or the Tibetan tradition. The guardians of the gateway are there to, the censors, the jinn, they're there to test, and you have to pass their test. That's the way it works with anything. So when you're dealing with technology and time, you have to pass, you know, muster. You have to be qualified to go where you're going. And when you've reached that level, then you're allowed to pass into it. So, you know, when you're fighting in a whole big conspiracy, you're just basically out of the game. It's like fighting outside of the Super Bowl trying to get in, fighting with all the guards, you know, and they're chasing you and you're hopping the fence. And no, you know, it's better to go in with a ticket.
So how does the Philadelphia experiment and Tesla and the time travel stuff fit? I mean, these are all contemporaries of Parsons. So you've got that project going, and then that ended up in Montauk. And was it Montauk, the Montauk chair, extraterrestrial technology, and which extraterrestrials gave it to us?
Well, that's what the story is. The Syrians, according to Preston. And of course, that's rather abstract and hard to pin down. You could also make an argument that Tesla was getting extraterrestrial communication. He was certainly communicating on a plane of existence that wasn't normal. But you know, these things are hard to pin down. The Philadelphia experiment, you know, definitely happened. And, in my, you know, according to all the synchronistic research I've had, because it was Al Bielek who told me that the Anderson family were the custodians of time. in the context of that, Dr. David Anderson, if he does indeed fit that role and is a custodian of time, he's here to clean up some of the problems that accrued with Montauk and the Philadelphia experiment. If we could look at,
has he emerged again? Anderson, is he still?
You didn't answer.
Missing in action?
Yeah, he's still alive.
David, he's still alive? Okay, go ahead.
He's still alive, and he's under a lot of non-disclosure agreements, so it makes him very unavailable. What I did have opportunity to ask him one time if he'd ever looked into the Philadelphia or Montauk projects, and he says, I've been tempted to, but he says, no, I haven't.
Okay.
That's a good way to create chaos.
Yes. Okay, but in the book, didn't you mention the specific species of aliens that, according to Preston, that brought the chair?
I said that the Syrians. He said that the Syrians.
Oh, Syrians. Okay, you broke up. Okay, so Syrians. Okay.
From the star system Sirius.
Syrians.
Yeah, Stewart says the same thing.
Yes, he does.
Wardlow says this.
Yeah, he does. And this is Syrians were renowned for their technology. That's the supposed
technology.
And of course,
have you talked to Stewart in recent years, or you guys?
I saw him a few years ago out at Montauk, but I haven't really, talked to him to any extent. Just more exchange.
See, there's a lot of. I'm sorry.
Just exchanging pleasantries. That was all we did.
Pleasantries. Okay. Well, there's a lot of time travel people coming out now. I don't know if you're aware. There's a lot of people that say they're in the secret space program. A lot of people that have been in the time travel teleportation programs. And so I wondered if you knew anything about the various programs, because you did the Montauk part.
Yeah, you see, a lot of people are attention whores. And what I try to do is, and they make attention, and you can get attention for a lot of things. And what I'm interested in is where all my work has brought me to the actual science of time travel, which I put up at the Time Travel Education Center. And so people say all sorts of things, and it's like, where are we going with this? What are we going to do with it? I'm trying to nail it down. I mean, I could tell stories better than most of these people and make them more cohesive. Mm-hmm. But I'm not going to, I could make them up. I could make up better stories. I don't do that. I'm not saying that some of these people haven't traveled in time, but there is such, I'm very pragmatic. So, people will say all sorts of things to get attention. Preston was accused of doing that, of trying to get attention and bask in the limelight. He wouldn't give up all of his secrets. That's for sure. But go ahead.
Oh, well, Peter, when you're in in those chambers, do you go elsewhere in time? Do you experience another kind of consciousness that isn't the regular 3D? It doesn't matter what science or not science. Is there a phenomenon that you directly feel?
Well, let me clarify. I have not seen those chambers. Those books are not my books. Those are Radu Cinemar's. He talks of them, and I would say, yeah, he does. He goes into a very deep consciousness, and of course, his message to the world is a very profound message. He's going somewhere with it, and it's very instructive and it's very positive. I know there have been a lot of people that try and get attention, but I don't have time to follow everybody. I'm very directed in what I do. So, it's like, science is not the be all and the end all, but I'm saying it is.
I keep getting you. They want I get it that you're supposed to go and have a direct experience, that all this is pulling you for you to have an experience. That's what I keep
can
getting.
Say something about that. I'm certainly open to that. I mean, you're right. It seems like it's an inevitable fact because I've always tried to build a credible case for what I'm talking about. I call a spade, so to speak, and I'm not trying to sell people on my intuition or phantasmagorical things. Although I deal with those, I'm trying to bridge a reality. And so Radu Sinamar said to me over 10 years ago that I promise I will do everything I can to show you some of the things that I've seen here. Now in his work, he's evolved way beyond where he was then. He's now dialoguing with people from the inner earth, as he says. He's having very deep communion with them, as you'll read in the new book, Inside the Earth, which I know you want to do a show on the 30th, and in the new book that I'm now editing and translating called Forgotten Genesis, which goes back into the earlier history of mankind. So he said, I will do everything I can. David Anderson has said he would like to show me his facility. What that means, I don't know. But, do I get to see it? Do I get to see the time reactor on? Do I get to see somebody in it? Do I get to go in it? And he said, and when I brought this up to him when I last spoke to him in the fall of 2017, I mentioned this. I said, you said I could see your facility someday. And he says, well, that day's getting closer and closer, he said. So it seems inevitably, of course, that was almost 2 years ago. So maybe the day will get close. He did say to me about 6 weeks ago, maybe less, about 6 weeks ago, he said, I'd like to spend some time with you outside of the project. He didn't say what the project was, but I assume that means in an informal setting outside of, anything else. I have invited him to meet me in Transylvania this year if he wants, but I can't expect him to come to his favorite location there in the Chucklavina Cave, which is probably the most important area as far as he's concerned about time travel phenomena. I'll be visiting this summer. But I've invited him to come along, but I can't expect him to show up for a number of reasons. But he's invited to come visit me there if he wants.
Oh, that'd be delightful if he did. So I want to make sure we finish this whole Jack Parsons thing. So what we have? We have about 25 minutes. What do we need? Okay, so Cameron, the woman you met, that was Parsons'
wife,
right? And that was his last wife. He had several wives?
Well, he had several wives. He had Helen Parsons,
two,
who went over to Wilfred Talbot Smith, who was the lodge master. They show him as the lodge master. They don't use his real name. They call him Alfred, the Magus, the Sage. But that's portraying Wilfred Talbot Smith. And he married, so Helen left Jack because Jack had fallen for Helen's younger sister, Sarah. And she's often, I don't know if Sarah actually married Jack, but they might as well have been married because they were a couple.
Mm-hmm.
And Sarah is portrayed as Patty. And she is a real wild card in the drama. She sneaks into the Magus' magic box and gets all these secret recordings. And she's like using these recordings to seduce and manipulate Jack and to tell. She's like a real manipulator and a real wild card. And this, of course, is suggesting that Sarah Northrop Parsons Hubbard was the same. And Cameron would never give to me, Sarah, a clean bill of health as far as not being a plant. Sarah was molested by her stepfather, and so she was, I guess, the profile of somebody who could be a Manchurian candidate. I can't speak for that. She was very troubled. She was very dramatic. She acted like an abused woman in her divorce from Ron. And she, so, you don't know how much she's telling the truth and how much she's exaggerating. What you can say for sure is that her dramatic accusations of Hubbard smack of someone who has been abused. Whether that abuse was in her earlier life and her blaming of Hubbard was just projecting her earlier abuse on him, or he did indeed abuse her, I do think that he had a complete wildcat on his hands in either case. Whether he abused her or not, he had a wildcat on his hands that he could not control. And may have, because he certainly flew the coop and got away from her by flying off to Cuba, and getting the hell out of her environment. But, so anyway, that, Cameron was the whole, I guess what you'd say. She used to say to me, she says, people always want to know about Jack. They want to study Jack. They want to learn about Jack, but they don't understand that all of his work was about me. And she was the result of the Babylon work. And he was trying to incarnate the Babylon working. And she said that, after Jack died, she began to get, her reddish hair began to get white. Her face began to get a little craggy. And she said she started to carry a wand or a staff like Gandalf. She began to look a little like Gandalf, She had that. Oh, wow. She was becoming, a metaphor for Babylon. She says, look, I'm not Babylon, but I am Babylon. In other words, she's not the end-all, the be-all and the end-all of Babylon. But she says there's many people who represent that energy. She says the people of my generation, she thought of me as one of the moon children, in other words, that all these kids that were born, I was born right down the road from where that took place. I say right down the road, I was born in San Fernando, which is not far at all from Pasadena. So it was, it's just like she was that step forward. Now we wait till 50 years after her death. I am going to be doing a book in the future. I have a book that's online to my paid subscribers called L. Ron Hubbard, The Tao of Insanity. And that book goes into aspects of Hubbard that aren't necessarily appreciated or recognized. They don't have so much to do with Scientology. It has more to do with magic. And that book is a precursor to another book that the working title is The Occult Biography of L. Ron Hubbard, where I'm going to go into his role in the Babylon working and some of these Wilson connections and sort of introduce that to an audience that is more Hubbard prone. My current books that are out on Parsons, Montauk Revisited, is basically Montauk oriented. It's not Scientology or Hubbard oriented, although Hubbard plays a role in it. I have another book. See, when I explained that accident I had to you, I also had a lot of other stuff going on around me through the late 90s, and my life became very jammed because I ended up, getting divorced, and that threw a lot of chaos and tumult into my life. So I ended up, during that I was doing Stewart's books, which came as a relief because I did not have to do any writing. I just needed to edit and typeset and process it. Then I did a book with Alexander Bruce, The Philadelphia Experiment Murder, a book with Wade Gordon. I didn't have to do any work. I mean, I did do work, but I didn't have to do writing work. And because I was so busy with not only the divorce, but the aftermath of the divorce, it stopped my writing career. I was able to crank out The Music of Time, which was more of a cookie cutter book because I just had to tape record Preston and edit it. So life was catching up with me. And so I had a lot of energies. I was being attacked from a lot of different quarters, none of which you would have heard about if you were, but what I did is I did an exorcism in the form of writing. It was a book called Synchronicity and the Seventh Seal. And that book is filled with a lot of occult stuff. But part of the book, which I sent to you today, Janet, is a stream of the different chapters together, tells the story of all the Jack Parsons stuff that happened to me. And I had to clean out and like exercise all the energy around me. And that book came out as The Synchronicity and the Seven Seal, which basically was very successful in dispelling all of those occult energies that had been, in my space. So that was a very successful book. And so, but one of the things that happened is a very interesting story. The second time I went to meet Cameron, well, I actually went to California to introduce my wife and my daughter to my old neighbors and to my sister. So, and my brother. So we had a family reunion. We had an old neighborhood reunion. And I sent my family home, and then I went to meet with Cameron for the second time. And I was going to go back to the old house where all of this stuff had taken place. Now, the house was torn down. I also went to the Pasadena Library and looked into the actual events of what happened, looked up all the newspapers. And when I got to the place, the corner where the parsonage was, I saw a sign. It said for sale. It was just a lot. I don't think there might have been a house there. I don't remember. But it just said Wilson Realty. I thought that was funny. And then I was looking for where the coach house was, which was a different address. And this old man came walking up the street. He was an old man. He looked like something out of time. And I asked him, and I told him what I was doing. He says, Parsons? He says, the Parsons Corporation. That's down there. And he started telling me where it was. What do you mean the Parsons Corporation? He says, yes, it's the Parsons Corporation. I never heard of it. It was the Ralph Parsons Corporation. But he's hearing Parsons. And I go, what do they do there? He goes, implants. I go, what do you mean they do implants? What implants? He goes, aviation implant. Now, what in the hell is an aviation implant? Doesn't make any sense. He was he was British. He was a pilot for the RAF, he said. So he looked like he'd been through some PTSD himself. He's talking about aviation implants. And, of course, implants were the stock and trade of Scientology, clearing people of implants. So I thought that was very funny. Now, what happens... Now, this synchronicity continues with the aviation implants because I had all this film that I took. So the next thing, I'm going over, Preston is now hiring an airplane to go over Montauk, flying over Montauk because they're doing funny things there. They're doing all this, they won't let anybody on, they're excavating, all this stuff. And so he hires an airplane, and he said that the pilot was very skittish about going over the base. He's going to go out again and get some more footage, and he offers to take me. So I go in the airplane with him. It's a small little thing, and there's just room I'm in the back, and Preston is up front with the pilot. And so I have my camera. It's the same camera I was just in Pasadena with. And I'm fumbling with it. I can't, and I'm screwing it up. I actually lose the footage because I open it up and the light exposed to it. And because I'm putting so much focus on the camera, I begin to get airsick. And because it's like trying to read in a car. So I started to lose it. And and they start talking to me. I said, please guys, don't talk to me. I'm so sick. I got to hold on to my stomach. Just don't talk to me. I'm okay, but just don't talk. So then the next thing I know is I hear this grinding of the plane. The plane is starting to go down. It's going, oh my God. And I make this, it's what I learned this in Scientology, but it's also from magic. It's make a postulate. Postulate is decision. I said, this plane is not going down. Everything's going to be right. And right as I think that and project this out to the universe, I see Preston's hand reach over to the motor casing. He puts his hand on the motor casing as if he was doing Reiki on the airplane, and you hear the motor goes, and then it just went back into normal.
My God.
They did the plane ride. We landed at the East Hampton airport, and we get out, and I said, Preston, I've got to sit down. I'm just like, I still got to just sit down and get my bearings. So we went over to a bench, and we're just sitting there. And after about 15 minutes, he says, are you okay? I said, yeah, I just need about 5 more minutes. And he says, that plane almost went down. I said, I know. He says, I put my hand over there. He says, I'm pretty good with motors, which he certainly is. And, years later, he didn't remember that. I reminded he did not remember it at all, but it definitely happened. So I lost my footage. Now, we went out, it was probably that same summer. No, it wasn't that summer. It was years later. It was the first day I met Stuart. I took him out on August 12th, and to go out to Montauk, we were going to do a talk in Amagansett. And when we get to the store in Amagansett, where we're going to be talking later that night, we're going to before we go into Montauk to pick up Preston or meet Preston, the woman who's going to sponsor us says, there's a woman who'd like to go with you. Is it okay? I said, sure. So she comes in, she gets in the car, we pick up Preston, and we're driving out to the Montauk Indians, Council Rock. And I'm telling the story that I just told you about the Parsons Corporation. And when we get to Council Rock, the woman says, I can't believe what you're saying about my Uncle Ralph. Uncle Ralph, no. He was from the Hamptons, and her name was Susan Parsons. She's the real Susan Parsons.
Oh my God.
So, that was some of the synchronicities I've had. And of course, Marjorie Cameron knew about the Parsons Corporation. She told me, she said that she went there when she heard about it, and she went, they had a building downtown LA.
So is Marjorie Cameron, who's Marjorie Cameron?
Marjorie Cameron Parsons. Her name was Marjorie Parsons. Marjorie Cameron.
Marjorie Parsons.
But, she went to the Parsons Corporation, the Ralph Parsons Corporation. They had an office building in LA, and she said she went to this 4th floor, and it was like this real weird, it was really weird. It was all dark, and there was, in the middle of the one floor, there was this, it was like this big rock. It was a big rock. It was lighted. It was the weirdest thing she ever saw. But that was her experience with the Ralph Parsons Corporation.
Was that like a meteorite or something?
That's what it sounded like. But we're not done. One of my readers who used to work at JPL, he was a big fan of Jack Parsons. He told me that the Ralph Parsons Corporation built underground cities. He used to work for them, or did some work for them, and they did he sent me a whole brochure. So they basically build underground cities. When Montauk Air Force Base needed to be cleaned up, they hired the Ralph Parsons Corporation to clean it up. That was a whole other story. Clean it up of munitions and toxic stuff. So I got to meet some of the executives for Ralph Parsons Corporation. And of course I heard they were having dinner, and they were talking all about the Montauk Project. They had heard all these weird stories, and they were there to clean it up.
Wow.
So
are you going to do a book on Cameron, the woman? Do you know about her?
Well, I think there is a biography that has been done on her. I offered to do a book with her, but she said she didn't want to do a book. She said that's a male thing, which that's not actually necessarily true, but that's the way she looked at it. She says, at the end of her life, she says, my work is done. And what I would like to do, because we are there's going to be a documentary that should show in August on Montauk Project. I participated in it. It was done in April. It's mostly been put together. It's supposed to, but I'm not allowed to announce it by contract. I mean, because they announce, that's their job. And then once they announce it, I can do it. But it's going to lead, probably, to a whole series like Strange Angel, only it's going to be about Montauk. And perhaps.
Oh, that'd be awesome.
And, it could lead to a lot of other things. Now, if that parlays, it could take about 4 seasons to get through the Montauk Project, but then will go into some of the other books. And if it does do that, I will make every effort. And I know that the producer who I've optioned the screen rights to has the same similarities to engage the estate of Marjorie Cameron, which that includes her art estate, and her, and to engage the heirs, her magical heir, who nobody really knows about, and she's just a regular mother, and a very nice person. So, their granddaughter. So I would like to engage them to get as much authenticity into Cameron's story, but it would be a screen story, how she integrates into that. And again, when you engage her, it's no different than engaging Crowley, perhaps even more evocative, because you're bringing on the real thing. You're bringing on the apocalyptic characteristics of life, of phenomena. So that's what I would hope to do, and certainly not be at center stage with myself at all, but work in the background to kind of get her story told as best as it can be told. But even this story of Parsons, which is very inaccurately told, is not harmful to his reputation at all. And it's not harmful to the legacy of who the man is. It's actually bringing it out of the woodwork so that people can talk and discuss it. And I always thought one of the greatest things, if I ever saw a movie, a historical movie that might include Napoleon or some character, what it does is it inspires you to go back and read the history and actually learn about the person. That's what a movie is good for.
Great. Get you going. Sasha, do you have any comments, feedback, questions? Oh, we have just a few minutes.
I don't know if you can hear me, but one of the books I read just a few months ago by you did go into the whole history of your interaction with Cameron. It's already there in one of your real cool books. I already read it.
Oh, okay. I have to reread it. I know.
She was like an initiation to me. She like kind of hit me over the head, figuratively, in the third eye, opened up, because I'm investigating a space-time project, which is all about, weird patriarchal control. I mean, I was just, and then I'm not, and then she kind of opens me up to the whole idea of the feminine energy, but on a very visceral level. And, it was really an initiation of great magnitude. I'm very happy to have had her in my life, especially, it's only a couple of years she was on her way out.
How old was she when you met her and when she died?
Well, she was in her 70s. I think she, was 74. I don't remember. But I got to meet her boyfriend as well. He wanted to meet me. He was an actor. And I also attended her memorial service, which was quite an experience. And I got to meet Jack Parsons. Jack was his best friend. George Frey. George Frey, Frey. He was a scientist who worked, he was in his 80s when I met him. He was a very nice man. He told me about Jack. In fact, he was, he told me a story about Jack's ashes. I'm trying to think. And it was a very interesting story. I told it in the book, but it was about Jack's, he says that, he once looked in Jack's magic box. Just like they show the magician having a box in the movie, Jack had a magic box. And he opened it. Mm-hmm. And it had a note on it. And it says, don't go any further, it may cost you your life. So
oh my goodness.
He closed it up. I said, whatever happened to the box? He goes, I don't know. That would be interesting. You'd have to ask Marjorie. So I called up Marjorie. And Marjorie had, by that time, married Sheridan Kimmel. Sheridan Kimmel was the character who inspired Randall McMurphy in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. She told me.
Oh my God.
He was red-haired and wild and crazy. That was her next husband. She said they got in some sort of a fight, and he basically tore that box apart and he burned.
Oh, we've ran out of time. We will have to pick up part 2 on the 30th, Peter Moon, June 30th. Come back and hear part 2. Thank you for today. Aloha, love and blessings.
Thank you so much.
Radio at freedomslips.com, and we'll be right back after this message.
Narco-syndicalist commune. We take it in turns to act as a sort of executive officer for the week. Yes. But all the decisions of that officer have to be ratified at a special bi-weekly meeting. Yes, I see. By a civil majority in the case of purely internal affairs. Be quiet. But by a 2/3 majority in the case of more... Be quiet. I order you to be quiet. Look, you stupid bastard, you've got no arms left. Yes, I have. Look! It's just a flesh wound.
I don't believe I've seen such a display of courage, skill, nerve, grace, and stupidity.
I'll do you for that. Oh, what? Come here. What are you going to do, bleed on me? I'm invincible. You're a loony. The Black Knight always triumphs.
Roundtable Live Monday through Friday, 1 a.m. till 4 a.m. Eastern Time. Bring your mind, bring your ideas, bring your voice. King Arthur had nothing on us here at Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com.
Most freeze. That's your cerebral cortex looking for an answer it doesn't have.
See? Even your brain knows you're screwed.
God is filling with adrenaline right now, whether you know it or not. The heart's beating fast. It's getting a little harder to breathe. The neurobiological system is telling it to run, but your knees are too weak to move.
Fear is not real. The only place that fear can exist is in our thoughts of the future. It is a product of our imagination, causing us to fear things that do not at present and may not ever exist. That is near insanity. Do not misunderstand me. Danger is very real, but fear is a choice. We are all telling ourselves a story.
You're listening to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. 100% listener-supported radio. Reporting to danger. Unafraid. Right here, where information never sleeps. Revolution Radio.
The original machine had a base plate of prefamulated amulite, surmounted by a malleable logarithmic casing, in such a way that the two spurving bearings were in a direct line with the